The morning sun cast long shadows across forward operating base Thunder as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos climbed into the driver's seat of the armored SUV. The vehicle's engine rumbled to life with a familiar growl that had become her daily soundtrack for the past 8 months in Afghanistan. Most people saw her as just another driver, shuttling officers and supplies between bases. They had no idea what was coming. Maria adjusted her helmet and checked her mirrors one more time. Today's mission seemed routine enough. Transport Colonel Williams and his intelligence team to a remote outpost near the Pakistani border. The kind of run she had done dozens of times before. But something felt different in the air that morning. The radio chatter seemed more urgent. The guards at the gate looked more alert. And her gut instinct, the one that had kept her alive through 2 tours, was telling her to pay attention. She had grown up in East Los Angeles, where driving meant survival, dodging gang territories, outrunning trouble, and knowing every shortcut in a 10-mile radius had been her childhood education. Her father, a mechanic, had taught her everything about engines before she could properly reach the pedals. Her mother, a nurse who worked double shifts, had taught her that sometimes you have to be tougher than the world expects you to be. The military had seemed like an escape route from a neighborhood where too many of her friends had ended up dead or in prison. Maria had enlisted at 18, thinking she would become a medic like her mother. Instead, the Army had other plans. Her driving scores during basic training had been off the charts. Her ability to navigate under pressure, handle vehicles in extreme conditions, and maintain calm in chaos had caught the attention of her instructors. Santos drives like she was born behind a wheel, her drill sergeant had written in her evaluation. Natural instinct for tactical movement and vehicle operations. Those words had sealed her fate. Instead of saving lives in a medical tent, she would be saving lives by getting people where they needed to go, when they needed to be there. Now, 3 years later, she was considered one of the best drivers in her unit. But being the best at something the military considered a support role meant that most people overlooked her tactical potential. To them, she was just the person who made sure they got from point A to point B without getting lost. They saw the uniform, the rank, and the fact that she spent her days behind a steering wheel instead of behind a rifle. What they did not see was the hours she spent studying maps of the region, memorizing every road, trail, and potential ambush point within a 100-mile radius. They did not know about the extra weapons training she had completed during her leave time, or the tactical driving courses she had taken at her own expense. They had no idea that she could field strip an M4 rifle blindfolded, or that her marksmanship scores rivaled those of the infantry soldiers she transported. Colonel Williams emerged from the command tent with his team, 3 intelligence officers, and a translator who looked nervous about the day ahead. The colonel was a career officer who had earned his rank through desk work rather than battlefield experience. His team was valuable for their analytical skills, but none of them had seen real combat. They climbed into the SUV with the casual confidence of people who believed their driver would handle any problems they might encounter. "Morning, Santos," Colonel Williams said as he settled into the passenger seat. "Beautiful day for a drive, wouldn't you say?" "Yes, sir," Maria replied, though she noticed the weather report had mentioned unusual radio interference in their sector. Small details that others missed, but details that could mean the difference between life and death in a combat zone. "Route's been cleared by the advance team. Should be smooth sailing." The intelligence team chatted quietly in the back seats as Maria pulled away from the base. They were discussing intercepted communications, troop movements, and strategic positions. Information that was valuable but academic to people who had never been shot at. Maria listened with half an ear while focusing on the road ahead, and the radio reports coming through her headset. The first 20 miles passed without incident. The road was a well-traveled supply route that connected several forward operating bases. Other military vehicles shared the route, supply trucks, armored personnel carriers, and the occasional convoy of contractors heading to construction sites. Everything appeared normal, which was exactly when Maria's instincts told her to be most alert. She had learned early in her deployment that the enemy's favorite tactic was to hit targets when they felt most secure. Roadside bombs were often placed along routes that had been safe for weeks, specifically because that safety made travelers careless. Ambushes happened in areas that seemed too open or too well monitored to be dangerous. The insurgents had learned to use their enemies' assumptions against them. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, Maria noticed something that made her unconsciously ease off the accelerator. A small pile of rocks beside the road that had not been there during her last trip through this area. It could have been nothing. Rocks fell from trucks. Children played games that left behind random piles of stones. But it could also have been a marker, a signal to someone watching from the hills that overlooked this stretch of highway. "Something wrong, Santos?" Colonel Williams asked, noticing the change in their speed. "Just being cautious, sir," Maria replied. She keyed her radio to contact the base. "Thunder Base, this is Transport 7. Requesting status update on our route." The response crackled through her headset immediately. "Transport 7, route remains clear. No reported activity in your sector." But Maria's gut feeling was growing stronger. The radio report meant that no one had seen anything obvious, but she had learned to trust her instincts over official reports. Too many good soldiers had died because they relied on information that was 5 minutes old instead of trusting what their eyes and experience were telling them in real time. She made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing on the main highway as planned, Maria took a sudden right turn onto a secondary road that would add 15 minutes to their journey, but would take them through a different route entirely. "Santos, this isn't the way to the outpost," one of the intelligence officers called from the back seat. "Alternate route, sir," Maria replied. "Just following standard security protocols. Multiple casualties reported. Highway 7 is closed pending investigation." The coordinates were exactly where they would have been if Maria had continued on the original route. The roadside bomb that someone had planted and marked with that pile of rocks would have destroyed their SUV and killed everyone inside. Colonel Williams stared at Maria with new understanding, realizing that her decision to change routes had just saved all their lives. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. "Experience, sir," Maria replied, "and paying attention to details that don't belong." The radio continued to deliver updates about the attack. The IED had been a sophisticated device, designed specifically to target the type of armored SUV they were traveling in. 3 soldiers had been killed and 5 wounded when another vehicle had triggered the explosive. The attack had been carefully planned and perfectly executed, except for one small detail. The attackers had not counted on their target changing routes at the last minute. As they continued toward their destination, Maria realized that this was just the beginning. The intelligence team in her SUV was carrying information that someone was very interested in obtaining or preventing from reaching its destination. The roadside bomb had not been a random attack on a target of opportunity. It had been specifically planned to intercept their mission. Someone knew exactly where they were going, when they were going there, and what route they were supposed to take. That level of intelligence suggested either a security leak at their base or an enemy network that was far more sophisticated than anyone had realized. Either way, it meant that their troubles were far from over. The outpost they were heading to was located in a valley surrounded by hills that provided perfect overwatch positions for anyone who wanted to monitor or attack traffic in the area. Maria had studied the topography during her mission planning and had noted several potential ambush sites that could not be avoided once they entered the valley. If someone had planned the roadside bomb, they had almost certainly planned backup measures for targets that managed to avoid the initial attack. Colonel Williams was on his radio, reporting the situation to higher headquarters and requesting updated intelligence on potential threats in their area. But Maria knew that by the time new information filtered down through the chain of command, they would either be safely at their destination or dealing with whatever came next on their own. She checked her weapons one more time, her sidearm, and the M4 rifle that was standard equipment for all vehicle operators. The SUV also carried additional ammunition and medical supplies, along with communication equipment that would allow them to call for support if needed. But help would take time to arrive, and time was something they might not have if the enemy had planned as carefully as the roadside bomb suggested. The secondary road began to descend into the valley where their destination lay. Maria could see the outpost in the distance, a collection of concrete barriers, guard towers, and temporary buildings that housed a small garrison responsible for monitoring the border area. It looked peaceful from this distance, but Maria knew that appearances could be deceiving in a combat zone. As they approached the final stretch of their journey, Maria's radio came alive with a transmission that made her blood run cold. Transport 7. Be advised that Outpost Charlie has lost radio contact with higher headquarters. Last transmission indicated possible hostile activity in the area. The outpost they were heading to had gone silent. That could mean equipment failure, enemy action, or something worse. Maria slowed the SUV as she processed this new information and its implications. They were now heading toward a destination that might already be under attack or occupied by enemy forces, carrying passengers who had no combat experience and information that the enemy desperately wanted to obtain. "Sir," Maria said to Colonel Williams, "I recommend we hold position and wait for updated orders." But before the colonel could respond, their decision was made for them. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions in the hills around them, and Maria realized that they had driven directly into the trap that had been prepared as a backup to the roadside bomb. The enemy had anticipated that some targets might avoid the initial attack and had prepared accordingly. The SUV's armored windows spider-webbed as bullets struck them, and Maria heard the distinctive sound of rounds hitting the vehicle's armor plating. Her passengers were shouting in confusion and fear, but Maria's training took over. She had practiced this scenario dozens of times, and now muscle memory guided her actions as she prepared to fight for all their lives. The first volley of gunfire shattered the morning quiet like thunder in a clear sky. Maria's hands tightened on the steering wheel as bullets struck their armored SUV from multiple directions. The spiderweb cracks spreading across the bulletproof windows told her they were facing more than just random small arms fire. These were coordinated attacks from elevated positions using weapons designed to penetrate vehicle armor. "Get down. Everyone down," Maria shouted to her passengers as she floored the accelerator. The SUV lurched forward with a roar of engine power that she had been saving for exactly this moment. Behind her, she could hear Colonel Williams trying to coordinate with headquarters on the radio, while the intelligence team pressed themselves against the floor of the vehicle. Maria's mind switched into combat mode, a mental state she had trained for, but never fully experienced until now. Every detail became crystal clear: the angle of incoming fire, the terrain features that could provide cover, the distance to potential defensive positions. Her civilian driving experience from the streets of Los Angeles merged with her military training to create something entirely new. The enemy had chosen their ambush site well. The valley road provided limited maneuver room, with steep hills on both sides that gave the attackers commanding fields of fire. But they had made one critical mistake in their planning. They had assumed their target would react like most military drivers, who were trained to call for backup and await instructions rather than take aggressive action. Maria was not most military drivers. She yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, sending the SUV into a controlled skid that carried them off the paved road and onto the rocky terrain beside it. The vehicle's suspension groaned under the stress, but the military-grade components held as she powered through loose gravel and small boulders that would have stopped a civilian vehicle cold. "Santos, what are you doing?" Colonel Williams managed to shout over the noise of gunfire and engine roar. "Staying alive, sir," Maria replied, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. She had spotted something during her route studies that might save them, an old creek bed that cut through the hills about half a mile ahead. If she could reach it, the natural depression would provide cover from the elevated firing positions and give them options for either escape or defense. The enemy fire followed them as they bounced across the rough ground. Maria could hear the distinctive crack of sniper rifles mixed with the rapid chatter of automatic weapons. These were not random insurgents with old rifles. This was a well-equipped force with military-grade weapons and professional tactics. Someone had invested serious resources in stopping their mission. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked past their front bumper and exploded against a boulder 20 yards away. The blast wave rocked the SUV and filled the air with dust and debris, but Maria kept the vehicle moving forward. She had learned from video games and action movies that the worst thing you could do in an ambush was to stop moving and become a stationary target. "Thunder Base, this is Transport 7. Colonel Williams was shouting into his radio handset. "We are under heavy attack. Grid reference 41 SMD 23 456-78,901. We need immediate air support. The radio crackled with static before a voice responded. Transport 7, Thunder Base. Be advised that air support is committed to another operation. Estimated time for assistance is 45 minutes. 45 minutes might as well have been 45 hours. Maria knew they had to solve their problem themselves, and they had to do it quickly. The armored SUV could absorb small arms fire, but the enemy was clearly equipped with armor-penetrating weapons that would eventually find their mark. She reached the creek bed just as another RPG round exploded behind them, showering the SUV with rocks and dirt. The natural depression was deeper than she had hoped, nearly 8 feet below ground level and wide enough to maneuver in. More importantly, the banks on either side would block most of the enemy fire from the hilltop positions. Maria brought the SUV to a stop behind a cluster of large rocks that had been deposited by flash floods over the years. The sudden quiet after the engine stopped was broken only by the distant sound of shouting voices as the enemy forces repositioned themselves to maintain contact. "Everybody out," Maria ordered. "We need to establish a defensive perimeter before they figure out where we went." Colonel Williams and his intelligence team scrambled out of the SUV, their academic training providing no guidance for their current situation. They looked to Maria for leadership, and she realized that regardless of rank or military protocol, she was now the person responsible for keeping them alive. Maria grabbed her M4 rifle and the spare ammunition from the SUV's storage compartments. She also collected the squad automatic weapon that was part of the vehicle's standard equipment, along with several hand grenades that might prove useful if the enemy tried to assault their position. "Sir," she said to Colonel Williams, "I need you to get on that radio and give headquarters our exact position. Tell them we're going to try to hold this position until help arrives, but they need to know that we're facing a professional military force, not random insurgents." While the colonel worked on communications, Maria positioned the intelligence team in covered positions among the rocks and gave them quick instructions on basic defensive procedures. None of them were combat soldiers, but they could at least watch for enemy movement and alert her to threats from different directions. The creek bed provided good protection from direct fire, but Maria knew their safety was temporary. The enemy force would be moving to surround their position and would eventually find ways to attack them from angles that negated their cover. She needed to take proactive measures to disrupt the enemy's plans before they could organize a coordinated assault. Looking up at the hills around them, Maria could see muzzle flashes from several different positions. She counted at least 8 separate firing points, which suggested an enemy force of between 20 and 30 fighters. Professional spacing and coordination indicated these were trained soldiers rather than militia or insurgents. But Maria noticed something else that gave her an idea. The enemy positions were concentrated on the hillsides overlooking the road where they had originally been attacked. The fighters had positioned themselves to dominate that area, but had not yet moved to cover the creek bed effectively. Their confidence in their initial plan was creating a tactical opportunity that Maria intended to exploit. She worked her way along the creek bed to a point where the bank was low enough to provide a firing position with a good view of the nearest enemy position. 2 fighters with an RPG launcher were setting up to fire down into the creek bed, thinking they had their targets trapped and helpless. Maria had qualified as an expert marksman with the M4 rifle, but shooting at paper targets on a range was very different from engaging human enemies in combat. She took a deep breath, acquired her target through the rifle's optics, and squeezed the trigger with the steady pressure her instructors had drilled into her during countless hours of practice. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and through her scope she saw the first enemy fighter spin and fall. His partner looked around in confusion, trying to figure out where the shot had come from. Maria's second shot dropped him before he could locate her position or call a warning to his teammates. 2 down, approximately 28 to go. But those 2 shots had accomplished more than just reducing the enemy numbers. Maria had seized the initiative and turned from hunted prey into an active threat that the enemy would have to deal with. She moved quickly to a new position before returning fire could find her, using the natural cover of the creek bed to stay hidden while looking for her next targets. The enemy force was beginning to react to the unexpected resistance. Instead of the quick elimination of trapped targets they had planned, they were now facing an unknown number of defenders who were fighting back effectively. Maria could hear shouting in a language she did not recognize as the enemy fighters tried to coordinate their response. She found her next target, a sniper who had positioned himself in rocks overlooking the main road. He was scanning the creek bed with a scoped rifle, trying to locate whoever had killed his teammates. Maria took careful aim and fired, watching through her scope as the enemy sniper jerked backward and disappeared behind the rocks. 3 down. But now the enemy knew approximately where she was shooting from, and rifle fire began to pour into the creek bed around her position. Maria pressed herself against the bank as bullets whined overhead and ricocheted off the rocks around her. She had gotten their attention, but now she needed to keep moving to avoid being pinned down and destroyed. Colonel Williams crawled over to her position, staying low to avoid the enemy fire. "Santos, I've got headquarters on the line. They want to know our tactical situation. Tell them we're engaged with a reinforced squad of professional fighters with military equipment," Maria replied while changing magazines on her rifle. They had this whole thing planned out, the roadside bomb, the ambush, probably a backup plan for the outpost too. This isn't random. She moved to another firing position and spotted movement on the hillside across from them. Enemy fighters were working their way down the slope, trying to get closer to the creek bed where they could use grenades or direct assault tactics. Maria opened fire on the moving figures, forcing them to seek cover and slowing their advance. The intelligence team was adapting to their situation better than she had expected. One of the officers had taken over radio communications, while Colonel Williams coordinated with headquarters. Another was serving as a spotter, calling out enemy movements he could observe from his position. The translator, despite his earlier nervousness, had found an old hunting rifle in the SUV and was contributing accurate fire against targets Maria designated. But ammunition was not unlimited, and Maria knew that time was working against them. The enemy had superior numbers and could afford to take casualties while working closer to their position. Eventually, they would get close enough to use grenades or organize a rush that could overwhelm the small defensive team. Maria needed to do something unexpected that would disrupt the enemy's tactical plan and buy them time for reinforcements to arrive. Looking around the creek bed, she noticed something that gave her another dangerous idea. The old watercourse had carved several small side channels over the years, creating a network of natural trenches that extended up into the hills. If she could work her way through those channels without being detected, she might be able to get behind some of the enemy positions and attack them from an unexpected direction. It would be extremely risky, leaving her isolated and potentially cut off from her teammates, but it might be their only chance to survive the next 40 minutes. "Sir," she said to Colonel Williams, "I'm going to try something. Keep everyone here and maintain defensive fire. Don't let them know I'm gone. Santos, you can't leave your position. That's an order." Maria looked at the colonel with new understanding of the difference between theoretical leadership and combat reality. "Sir, with all due respect, staying here means we all die when they get close enough to rush us. I can do more damage moving than I can hiding behind these rocks." Before he could respond, she was moving. Maria worked her way along the main creek bed until she found one of the side channels that led up into the hills. The narrow depression was barely wide enough for one person, but it provided concealment as she began working her way toward the enemy positions. The sound of gunfire continued behind her as her teammates maintained their defensive positions. Maria hoped the enemy would interpret the ongoing resistance as proof that all the defenders were still in the creek bed, giving her the element of surprise she would need for what she was planning to do next. Maria crawled through the narrow side channel on her belly, using every piece of cover the rocky terrain provided. The sound of gunfire behind her was constant now, as her teammates kept up defensive fire to mask her movement. Each shot echoed off the hills, creating enough noise to cover the small sounds she made moving through loose gravel and dry vegetation. The channel wound upward through the hills like a natural maze. Maria had to feel her way forward in some places where the passage was barely wider than her shoulders. Thorny shrubs caught at her uniform and equipment, but she ignored the scratches and focused on staying quiet and invisible. One mistake now would alert the enemy to her presence, and trap her in a position where she could not defend herself. After 20 minutes of careful movement, she reached a position where the channel curved around a large boulder. Maria could hear voices very close by, enemy fighters coordinating their next assault on the creek bed below. She moved forward inch by inch until she could see through a gap in the rocks. 3 enemy soldiers were positioned in a natural fighting hole they had improved with sandbags and camouflage. They had a clear view of the creek bed where her teammates were defending, and one of them was speaking into a radio handset while pointing at different positions. Maria realized she was looking at a command post that was coordinating the entire attack. The tactical situation was even worse than she had thought. Through her observation position, she could see enemy fighters moving through the hills in a coordinated pattern designed to surround the creek bed completely. They were not just trying to kill the Americans. They were positioning themselves to capture the intelligence team alive and interrogate them about the information they were carrying. Maria counted the weapons she could see from her hidden position. The 3 fighters in the command post had automatic rifles, a radio, and what looked like a case of hand grenades. But, more importantly, they had maps and documents spread out on a flat rock, apparently planning the final assault on her teammate's position. She had 2 grenades of her own, plus her rifle with 3 full magazines remaining. The element of surprise would give her a significant advantage, but only if she used it perfectly. Any mistake would alert the entire enemy force to her presence and eliminate any chance of disrupting their coordinated attack. Maria pulled the pin on her first grenade and counted to 3 before rolling it into the command post. The explosion was deafening in the confined space between the rocks, and she was moving before the dust settled. Her rifle came up as she charged into the enemy position, engaging targets that had survived the grenade blast. The first enemy fighter was struggling to reach his weapon when Maria's rifle fire cut him down. The second had been stunned by the explosion and was trying to clear his head when her next shots found their mark. The third fighter had been farther from the grenade and was bringing his own rifle up when Maria's final shot dropped him. 3 more down. The command post was eliminated, but Maria knew the explosion would bring other enemy fighters running to investigate. She had perhaps 2 minutes before this position became untenable. She used that time to gather intelligence from the documents the enemy had been using. The maps and papers told a story that made her blood run cold. This attack was not an isolated ambush. It was part of a larger operation designed to capture or kill multiple American intelligence teams operating in the region. The roadside bomb on Highway 7 had been just one part of a coordinated plan that involved attacks on 3 different convoys carrying classified information. More importantly, the documents revealed that the outpost they had been traveling to was indeed under attack. A separate enemy force was assaulting Outpost Charlie at the same time, and the garrison there was fighting for their lives. The Americans were facing a sophisticated enemy operation that had been planned for weeks and involved far more resources than anyone had realized. Maria stuffed the most important documents into her cargo pockets just as she heard voices approaching her position. Multiple enemy fighters were converging on the command post to investigate the explosion. She had to move immediately or be trapped and overwhelmed. But instead of retreating back down the channel toward her teammates, Maria made another tactical decision that defied conventional military wisdom. She moved deeper into the hills, toward the positions where more enemy fighters were located. Sometimes the best defense was an aggressive offense that kept the enemy off balance and unable to execute their planned tactics. The documents she had captured showed her where the other enemy positions were located. Instead of stumbling around blindly, she now had a tactical map that revealed the entire ambush force. Maria could see that the enemy had positioned fighters in 3 main groups. The command post she had just destroyed, an overwatch position on the highest hill that provided sniper support, and an assault group that was preparing to attack the creek bed from the north. She worked her way toward the overwatch position, using the natural terrain features to stay hidden. The enemy fighters she encountered were focused on the battle below and were not expecting to be attacked from behind. Maria's training in urban warfare from her Los Angeles background served her well here. Moving unseen through hostile territory required the same skills whether you were avoiding gang members or enemy soldiers. The overwatch position was more elaborate than the command post had been. Two snipers had constructed a well-camouflaged hide that gave them commanding views of the entire valley. They had been providing precision fire support for the assault teams and had probably been responsible for keeping her teammates pinned down in the creek bed. Maria approached the position from the blind side, where the sniper's attention was focused downrange toward their targets. She could hear one of them calling out range and wind corrections to his partner. Professional soldiers with professional equipment and training, exactly the kind of opponents that conventional tactics would struggle against. But Maria was not using conventional tactics anymore. She was fighting like a street survivor who had learned that rules were for people who could afford to follow them. Her second grenade landed in the sniper hide before either enemy fighter knew she was there. The explosion eliminated the overwatch position and sent debris flying across the hillside. Two more enemy fighters dead, and their tactical advantage in precision fire support was gone. But, more importantly, Maria had disrupted the enemy's ability to coordinate their assault on the creek bed. She could hear confusion and shouting from multiple directions as enemy fighters tried to understand what was happening to their carefully planned operation. Radio traffic increased as surviving fighters attempted to report the attacks on their positions and coordinate a response to the unexpected threat in their rear area. Maria used their confusion to continue her attack. She moved toward the assault group that was preparing to attack her teammates from the north. According to the captured documents, this group consisted of 8 fighters with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. They were the main threat to the Americans in the creek bed, and eliminating them would significantly improve her team's chances of survival. But, as she approached the assault group's position, Maria realized that her luck was about to run out. One of the enemy fighters had been positioned as a rear guard, and he spotted her movement as she worked her way through the rocks. His shout of alarm alerted the entire assault group to her presence. Suddenly, Maria found herself facing 8 enemy fighters who knew exactly where she was and were bringing their weapons to bear on her position. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and caught in the open with limited cover. Everything she had accomplished would be meaningless if she was killed or captured in the next few seconds. Maria dove behind a boulder just as automatic weapons fire erupted around her. Bullets sparked off the rocks and whined overhead as she pressed herself into the smallest possible target. The enemy fighters were spreading out to surround her position, and she could hear them coordinating their movements to trap her. But Maria had one advantage that her enemies did not expect. She had grown up fighting for survival in situations where the odds were never fair and the rules never applied. When conventional tactics failed, you improvised. When improvisation was not enough, you got creative. When creativity was not enough, you got desperate. And Maria Santos was about to get very desperate indeed. She pulled her last grenade and prepared to make a stand that would either save her teammates or go down in military history as one of the most unlikely last stands ever recorded. The enemy fighters were closing in on her position, confident that they had finally cornered their elusive opponent. They were about to learn that cornering a fighter from East Los Angeles was very different from cornering a regular soldier. Maria waited until she could hear footsteps on both sides of her cover, then pulled the grenade pin and held the explosive device in her hand. Instead of throwing it immediately, she counted down the fuse timer while the enemy fighters moved closer to her position. This was a technique called cooking off the grenade, timing the explosion so the enemy could not throw it back or escape the blast radius. At the last possible second, she threw the grenade into the center of the enemy group and pressed herself against the ground behind her boulder. The explosion was massive, enhanced by the confined space between the rocks and the enemy fighters' ammunition supplies. Secondary explosions followed as enemy grenades and rifle ammunition cooked off in the heat. When the smoke cleared, Maria counted 5 more enemy fighters eliminated. The assault group had been destroyed, but 3 survivors were still moving and still dangerous. She engaged them with her rifle as they tried to reorganize, using precise marksmanship to eliminate threats before they could return effective fire. The hillside fell quiet except for the distant sound of gunfire from the creek bed, where her teammates were still defending their position. Maria had eliminated or disrupted every enemy position shown on the captured tactical maps. But she knew there were still more fighters out there, and They would be converging on her location very soon. She needed to get back to her team before the surviving enemy fighters could coordinate a new attack. But, as she started working her way back down the hillside, Maria heard something that made her freeze in place. Helicopter rotors. Multiple aircraft approaching from the south. Either rescue forces finally arriving, or enemy reinforcements that would turn this tactical victory into a devastating defeat. Maria had no way to identify the aircraft from her position, but she would know very soon whether her desperate gamble had bought enough time for American forces to arrive. Everything now depended on whose helicopters those were, and whether her teammates could hold their position for just a few more minutes. The helicopter rotors grew louder as Maria worked her way down the hillside toward the creek bed. She could hear multiple aircraft, which meant either a substantial rescue force or an enemy reinforcement that would overwhelm any remaining American defenders. Every step down the rocky slope brought the sound closer, but she still could not see the aircraft or identify their origin. Maria's radio crackled to life in her earpiece. All American forces, this is Raptor 6. Identify your position for friendly air support. The voice was distinctly American, speaking with the crisp professionalism of a military pilot. Relief flooded through her as she realized that reinforcements had finally arrived. She keyed her radio handset. Raptor 6, this is Transport 7 Alpha. I am approximately 400 meters north of the creek bed, moving toward friendly positions. Be advised there are still enemy fighters in the area. Transport 7 Alpha, Roger. We have visual on the creek bed position. Are you the friendly who has been engaging enemy positions in the hills? Maria almost smiled at the question. Affirmative, Raptor 6. I have been working on disrupting their tactical coordination. Outstanding work, Transport 7 Alpha. Stand by for danger close air support. The sound of the helicopters was directly overhead now, and Maria could see two Apache attack helicopters circling the valley like mechanical birds of prey. Their thermal imaging systems would be identifying heat signatures and movement patterns throughout the hills, locating any remaining enemy fighters who were still alive and active. But the enemy forces were not finished fighting. Even as the Apache helicopters began their attack runs, Maria could hear renewed gunfire from multiple positions around the valley. The surviving enemy fighters were making a final attempt to complete their mission before American air power could destroy them completely. Maria reached the edge of the creek bed just as rocket fire from the Apache helicopters began impacting enemy positions throughout the hills. The explosions were precise and devastating, eliminating threats with the kind of overwhelming firepower that only military aircraft could provide. But some enemy fighters had taken shelter in positions that were protected from air attack. She slid down the bank into the creek bed and found her teammates still maintaining their defensive positions among the rocks. Colonel Williams looked up as she approached, his expression mixing relief with amazement. Santos, what the hell did you do up there? We heard explosions and gunfire for the past hour, and suddenly, half the enemy fire just stopped, disrupted their command structure, and eliminated their overwatch positions. Maria replied matter-of-factly. Found their tactical plans too. This was a coordinated operation involving multiple targets. We were not the only team they were after. She handed Colonel Williams the documents she had captured from the enemy command post. Sir, you need to get this information to headquarters immediately. There are other American units under attack right now, and this intelligence could save lives. As Colonel Williams examined the captured documents, his expression grew increasingly grim. The scope of the enemy operation was far larger than anyone had realized. Multiple intelligence teams, supply convoys, and forward operating bases had been targeted simultaneously in what appeared to be a major offensive operation designed to cripple American intelligence gathering in the region. My God, the colonel muttered. If they had succeeded in capturing all these targets. He trailed off as he realized the implications. The intelligence information that would have been compromised could have endangered American operations throughout Afghanistan and beyond. The Apache helicopters had finished their initial attack runs and were circling back to engage any remaining enemy positions. Maria could hear the pilots coordinating over the radio as they searched for heat signatures and movement in the hills around the valley. Raptor 6, this is Transport 7. Be advised that some enemy fighters may have taken shelter in caves or deep rock formations that provide protection from air attack, Maria transmitted. Her tactical knowledge of the terrain was proving valuable even now that reinforcements had arrived. Roger, Transport 7. We are detecting minimal heat signatures at this time. Estimate enemy force has been reduced by approximately 80%. Ground forces are en route for cleanup and extraction. But Maria's combat instincts told her that the threat was not over. Professional military forces did not give up easily, and the enemy had invested too much in this operation to simply retreat when their initial plan failed. They would have prepared contingency measures for exactly this situation. Her suspicion was confirmed when new gunfire erupted from a position that the Apache helicopters had not detected. A small group of enemy fighters had remained hidden in a cave system that provided both protection from air attack and a concealed firing position overlooking the creek bed. Contact. East side of the creek bed. Maria shouted as bullets began striking the rocks around their position. The enemy fighters had waited until the helicopters moved away from their immediate area before revealing themselves, hoping to eliminate the American ground forces while the air support was repositioning. Maria's M4 rifle came up instinctively as she acquired targets in the cave entrance. The enemy position was well chosen, providing protection while allowing the fighters inside to engage targets in the creek bed. But Maria had spent the past hours studying this terrain and understanding how to use it tactically. Instead of engaging the cave entrance directly, where the enemy had superior cover, Maria worked her way to a position where she could see into the cave from an angle that the defenders had not anticipated. Her movement drew enemy fire, but it also exposed the muzzle flashes that revealed exactly where the enemy fighters were positioned inside the cave. Raptor 6. I have eyes on the remaining enemy position, Maria transmitted while engaging targets with her rifle. Grid reference 41 SMD 3456789012. Recommend rocket attack on cave entrance. The Apache helicopter responded immediately, launching a Hellfire missile that turned the cave entrance into a crater of broken rock and twisted metal. The explosion was so violent that it brought down part of the hillside, sealing any surviving enemy fighters inside the cave system permanently. Silence fell over the valley for the first time in over 2 hours. Maria performed a tactical reload of her rifle while scanning the surrounding hills for any remaining threats, but her experienced eyes saw nothing that indicated continued enemy presence. The battle was finally over. Transport 7, this is Raptor 6. We are showing no remaining heat signatures in the target area. Ground forces are 5 minutes out for extraction and site security. Maria acknowledged the transmission and then turned her attention to her teammates. The intelligence officers had performed far better under fire than she had expected, maintaining discipline and contributing to their defense despite having no combat training. Colonel Williams had proven himself as a leader under pressure, coordinating communications and making tactical decisions that had helped them survive the extended firefight. Ma'am, one of the intelligence officers approached her hesitantly. We never got your name or learned about your background. Where did you learn to fight like that? East Los Angeles, Maria replied with a slight smile. Sometimes the best military training happens before you ever put on a uniform. The sound of approaching helicopters filled the valley as ground forces arrived to secure the area and extract the intelligence team. But Maria knew that her part in this story was far from over. The documents she had captured would provide intelligence analysts with information about enemy operations that extended far beyond this single ambush. More importantly, her actions during the firefight would be reviewed and analyzed by military tacticians who would want to understand how a single soldier had eliminated over 24 enemy fighters and disrupted a sophisticated military operation. The lessons learned from her improvised tactics could be incorporated into training programs that would save American lives in future conflicts. As the rescue helicopters landed in the creek bed, Maria reflected on the events of the past few hours. She had started the day as just another driver, responsible for transporting passengers from one location to another. But when circumstances demanded more than routine performance, she had drawn on every skill and experience from her entire life to rise to the challenge. The streets of East Los Angeles had taught her to survive in hostile territory where conventional rules did not apply. The United States Army had given her weapons training, tactical knowledge, and the discipline to apply both under extreme pressure. But, most importantly, her own character had provided the courage to take action when action was needed, regardless of the personal risk involved. Colonel Williams approached her as the rescue team prepared to load them into the evacuation helicopters. "Santos, I'm going to make sure that headquarters understands exactly what happened here today. Your actions saved all our lives and prevented an intelligence disaster that could have compromised American operations throughout the region." "Thank you, sir," Maria replied. "I was just doing my job." But they both knew that was not entirely true. Maria Santos had done far more than her job that day. She had proven that heroism could come from unexpected places and that the most important qualifications for leadership under fire were not rank or position, but courage, competence, and the willingness to take action when others needed help. As the helicopter lifted off from the valley floor, Maria looked down at the battlefield where she had fought for her life and the lives of her teammates. The scattered debris and destroyed enemy positions told the story of a desperate fight against overwhelming odds that had ended in an unlikely victory. But Maria knew that this battle was just one small part of a much larger war, and that there would be other days when ordinary soldiers would be called upon to do extraordinary things. She had proven that a driver could become a fighter when circumstances demanded it. The question now was what other challenges lay ahead, and whether she would be ready when they came. 3 weeks later, Maria Santos sat in a conference room at Bagram Airfield, facing a panel of senior military officers who had traveled from multiple commands to debrief her about the engagement in the valley. The room was filled with colonels and generals whose combined combat experience spanned decades of warfare in multiple theaters, yet they were here to learn from a staff sergeant who had been considered just a driver until recently. The captured documents that Maria had recovered from the enemy command post had provided intelligence analysts with a treasure trove of information about insurgent operations throughout Afghanistan. The coordinated attacks she had disrupted were part of a larger campaign designed to eliminate American intelligence assets and capture classified information that could have compromised operations for months or years. Staff Sergeant Santos, the lead investigator, began. "According to after-action reports, you eliminated 32 enemy fighters during a 2-hour engagement while protecting 4 non-combatant personnel. Can you walk us through your tactical decision-making process during the firefight?" Maria had spent days preparing for this debriefing, working with intelligence analysts to reconstruct the timeline of events and identify the tactical factors that had contributed to her success. But sitting in front of these senior officers, she realized that the most honest answer was also the simplest one. "Sir, I did not have time for a formal decision-making process. The situation was developing too quickly for textbook tactics. I relied on my training, my knowledge of the terrain, and my instinct for staying alive in hostile territory." General Morrison, a veteran of 3 combat deployments, leaned forward with interest. "Your background report indicates that you grew up in a high-crime area of Los Angeles. How did that civilian experience contribute to your performance in combat?" It was a question that Maria had been thinking about constantly since the battle. The connection between urban survival skills and military tactics was not something that had been covered in any training manual, but it had been crucial to her success in the valley. "Sir, the fundamentals are the same whether you are dealing with gang members or enemy soldiers," Maria explained. "You need to understand terrain, predict threats, move without being detected, and take decisive action when violence becomes unavoidable. The weapons and equipment are different, but the mindset is very similar." The panel spent the next 2 hours going through every aspect of the engagement, from her initial decision to change routes to avoid the roadside bomb to her final assault on the cave position. Military analysts had used drone footage, radio intercepts, and physical evidence to create a detailed reconstruction of the battle, and they wanted to understand how a single soldier had achieved such decisive results against a numerically superior enemy force. What emerged from the debriefing was a case study in adaptive leadership and improvised tactics that would be studied in military schools for years to come. Maria had demonstrated that conventional wisdom about force ratios, defensive positions, and tactical doctrine could be overcome by aggressive action, superior knowledge of terrain, and the willingness to take calculated risks. The enemy force consisted of professional soldiers with military training and equipment, the intelligence analyst reported. They had planned this operation for weeks and had prepared contingencies for multiple scenarios. However, they had not planned for a single defender who would leave her protected position to conduct offensive operations in their rear area. Colonel Williams, who had been present for the entire debriefing, stood up to address the panel. "Gentlemen, I have worked with hundreds of military professionals during my career. Staff Sergeant Santos saved my life and the lives of my entire team through actions that went far beyond her assigned duties or training. She deserves recognition that reflects the significance of her contribution." The recommendation package that Colonel Williams had submitted included a nomination for the Silver Star, one of the military's highest decorations for heroism in combat. But the investigation had revealed actions that went beyond even that level of recognition, and the panel was considering whether Maria's performance warranted nomination for the Congressional Medal of Honor. After the formal debriefing concluded, General Morrison asked Maria to remain behind for a private conversation. When the room had cleared, he looked at her with an expression that mixed admiration with professional curiosity. "Santos, I have been fighting wars for 25 years, and I have never seen anything quite like what you accomplished in that valley. You turned a tactical disaster into a strategic victory through individual action that saved not just your immediate team, but potentially dozens of other American lives." He gestured toward the intelligence reports spread across the conference table. "The information you recovered has allowed us to prevent attacks on 3 other intelligence teams and 2 forward operating bases. The enemy network that planned this operation has been completely dismantled based on the documents you captured." Maria nodded respectfully, but she could sense that the general had something more specific to discuss with her. "The Army is facing new challenges that require new approaches to warfare," General Morrison continued. "We need soldiers who can adapt to unexpected situations, who can operate independently when conventional support is not available, and who can achieve strategic objectives through tactical innovation." He handed her a folder containing transfer orders and training schedules. "I am recommending you for immediate assignment to Special Operations Command. Your performance in the Valley suggests that you have the potential to contribute to missions that require exactly the kind of skills you demonstrated." Maria looked through the documents with growing amazement. The assignment would involve 6 months of specialized training followed by deployment with units that conducted the most challenging and sensitive operations in the military. It was an opportunity that normally took years of preparation and multiple deployments to achieve. "Sir, I appreciate the recommendation, but I am not sure I am qualified for special operations. My background is in transportation and logistics, not combat arms." General Morrison smiled. "Santos, you just eliminated a reinforced squad of professional soldiers while protecting non-combatant personnel in a coordinated ambush situation. Your qualifications speak for themselves." The conversation continued for another hour as the general explained the training pipeline and operational requirements for special operations assignments. Maria would attend advanced tactical schools, specialized weapons training, and leadership development programs that would prepare her for missions far more complex than anything she had previously imagined. But beyond the immediate assignment, General Morrison had a larger vision for Maria's military career. Her performance in the Valley had demonstrated leadership potential that extended far beyond technical skills or tactical knowledge. She had shown the ability to make life and death decisions under extreme pressure while maintaining responsibility for other people's welfare. "The military needs leaders who can inspire others through personal example," he explained. "Your story will be studied and discussed throughout the Army, but more importantly, it will demonstrate to other soldiers that heroism can come from unexpected places and that individual action can have strategic impact." As Maria prepared to leave Bagram Airfield for her new assignment, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the streets of East Los Angeles to recognition as one of the Army's most promising young leaders. The battle in the Valley had lasted only 2 hours, but it had changed the trajectory of her entire life. She thought about the enemy fighters she had killed during the engagement, professional soldiers who had families and beliefs and reasons for fighting that seemed as valid to them as her own motivations seemed to her. War was never simple or clean, and victory always came with costs that extended beyond the immediate participants. But Maria also thought about Colonel Williams and his intelligence team, who were alive because she had been willing to take action when action was needed. She thought about the other American units that had been saved because she had captured the enemy operational plans. And she thought about future soldiers who might benefit from the tactical lessons learned during her improvised defense. The medal ceremony took place 6 months later at the Pentagon, with Maria's family in attendance to watch her receive the Silver Star for exceptional heroism in combat. Her parents, who had immigrated from Mexico to give their children opportunities in America, sat in the front row as their daughter was recognized for actions that had saved American lives and disrupted enemy operations. But for Maria, the most meaningful recognition came from a different source. Letters began arriving from soldiers throughout the military, men and women who had heard about her story and had been inspired to believe that they too could rise to meet whatever challenges they might face. Young recruits wrote to thank her for proving that background and circumstances did not determine destiny. Experienced soldiers wrote to express their respect for her tactical innovations and leadership under fire. The story of the SUV driver who eliminated 32 enemies in a single engagement had become legend throughout the military, but Maria knew that legends were less important than reality. Real soldiers would face real challenges in future conflicts, and they would need real skills and real courage to protect themselves and their teammates. Her new assignment with Special Operations Command would provide opportunities to develop those skills and to share the lessons she had learned through practical experience. But, more importantly, it would allow her to continue serving the country that had given her family a chance for a better life, and to honor the memory of the soldiers who had not been as fortunate as she had been in the valley that day. As Staff Sergeant Maria Santos prepared for her next deployment, she carried with her the knowledge that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demanded nothing less than their absolute best. She had been just a driver when the day began, but she had become something more when her teammates needed her to be more. That transformation was available to any soldier who was willing to prepare for it, train for it, and accept it when the moment arrived. Maria Santos had proven that heroism was not about rank or position or recognition. It was about being ready to do whatever was necessary to protect the people counting on you, regardless of the personal cost or risk involved. The war would continue, and there would be other battles in other places against other enemies. But somewhere in those future conflicts, soldiers who had heard Maria's story would remember that a single person could make a difference, and they would find the courage to make that difference themselves when their moment came.